Beneath the rotting magnolias of Mississippi, a family lived whose names slipped through ledgers like smoke, yet whose shadows never left their porch. The nightshades were never counted correctly, and those who tried often vanished before they could finish the sum. In the year 1860, in the low green hills of northern Mississippi, stood a plantation that seemed to resist the march of time. Locals called it Black Magnolia, though on the maps of the day its name was rarely printed, and in the ledgers of the county seat, its owners were mentioned less often still. The Nightshade family lived there, an old southern clan of means, their fortune whispered to have been built on cotton, though no one could quite recall the sight of their wagons rolling into market. They were wealthy enough to command respect, reclusive enough to stir suspicion, and peculiar enough that their neighbors spoke of them in lowered tones. The Nightshades were not the sort of family one called upon. They were the sort of family one crossed oneself while passing. It was not that they were unseen. Quite the opposite. Alaric Nightshade, tall and commanding, would appear on courthouse steps with the air of a man who knew his place in the world. His wife, Celine, pale and elegant, was glimpsed on occasion in town, her carriage drawn by horses blacker than pitch, the wheels never seeming to leave tracks. Their children, two, 3, sometimes 4, depending on who was asked, were spotted in town at rare intervals, though no one could agree on their ages. Some said they were small and slight, others insisted they were tall and grown. Portraits painted of them hung in the courthouse for a short season, until they inexplicably vanished, the frames left empty. But the more one searched for proof of the Nightshades, the less one found. In census books their name appeared, then vanished. In property registries, a clerk would swear he had written them down, only to find the page blank the following week. Birth records, baptismal certificates, tax rolls all bore traces of ink erased by some unseen hand. Yet the estate still stood, its magnolia trees bending heavy over the veranda, its lanterns flickering at dusk. Something was present, even if the paper trail insisted otherwise. Stories filled the void that documents left behind. Children whispered that if you counted the nightshades seated at supper, you would never arrive at the same number twice. Farmers muttered that their land never withered in drought, nor flooded in storm. Travelers swore they saw the family watching from the second-floor balcony, unmoving, pale faces gleaming in lamplight. The people of the valley came to an uneasy conclusion. The Nightshades did not belong to the ordinary register of the living. They were present, but not fixed. Seen, but never properly recorded. A family misplaced, as if history itself refused to tally their names too carefully, for fear of what might be revealed if it did. The census men came with ink-stained fingers and sunburned faces, walking the lanes and dirt tracks of Mississippi in the summer of 1860, tallying souls like coins in a purse. They knew every household in the county, every acre accounted for, every head counted and measured. Yet when their ledgers reached the gates of Black Magnolia, something curious always unfolded. The Nightshade family would be written, names and numbers placed neatly in their columns, their household noted in proper order. But by the following season, sometimes by the following week, the pages would blur, the lines thin, and where their names once rested, there was nothing but blank space. No ink stains, no erasure marks, as though the pen had hesitated and never touched the page at all. Still, no one in the valley could claim the Nightshades were absent. They were seen in pews on Sundays, Celine Nightshade's veil catching the sun through the chapel window, her children shifting silently beside her. They were spotted at funerals, standing just far enough from the grave to seem both mourners and watchers. At the markets, their servants bartered for flour and salt. And at courthouse auctions, Alaric himself raised his hand with such certainty that no man dared challenge his bid. To those who lived and breathed within the county, the Nightshades were undeniably present. Yet for the census clerks who returned months later, the evidence was gone. Whispers rose. Some said the ink curdled on the page, that it turned transparent when it bore the weight of their names. Others insisted the census men feared them, deliberately omitting the family from their records to keep peace. But the most unsettling rumors came from those who swore the numbers themselves betrayed something wrong. In one year, the Nightshades were listed as a family of 5, in another, as 7, then 4. The numbers refused to settle, always shifting, never certain, as if the count itself resisted finality. At dinner, the stories claimed, you could sit across from them and never agree how many filled the table. One guest would swear to 3 children, another to 6, and by morning even their memories refused to align. This uncertainty spread like mildew in the county's conscience. Neighbors muttered that perhaps the Nightshades were not one family at all, but several, overlapping and fading like ghostly impressions on glass. The minister, when pressed, admitted uneasily that he could not remember how many times he had baptized their children, or if he ever had. The undertaker, pale as bone, confessed he once saw 2 coffins lowered into the ground at Black Magnolia, yet the very next day he saw the deceased among the living again, pale and quiet, watching from the balcony as though no grave had ever claimed them. It was not absence that haunted the Nightshades, but multiplication. They were there, undeniably there, and yet their presence refused to be measured, a family that never allowed itself to be counted twice the same way. Black Magnolia stood at the end of a road that was more shadow than soil, its path swallowed by vines that crept like fingers toward the passing traveler. The estate had been raised decades earlier, when cotton ruled the delta and fortunes rose as fast as they rotted. Yet, unlike the proud, white-pillared mansions of the neighboring families, Black Magnolia never seemed to celebrate its wealth. Its verandas were wide, yes, and its roof steep and dignified, but there was something funereal in its posture, as though the house itself bent beneath a weight no timber should carry. The shutters were the first thing people noticed. They were nailed shut from the inside, every window sealed against the light. Carpenters swore they heard the hammering long after dusk, a methodical thud that carried across the valley like a second heartbeat. On summer mornings, when the rest of Mississippi boiled with heat, Black Magnolia's windows reflected nothing. No sun, no sky, just a dim, warped shimmer, as though the glass preferred to keep its own counsel. At night, however, some swore they saw candlelight flickering from those same sealed panes, too steady and too many to belong to a single household. The magnolia trees gave the estate its name, but they were not like any others in the county. In spring they bloomed white, the way magnolias should, heavy blossoms that perfumed the entire valley. But by midsummer the flowers blackened, curling inward, their petals turning the color of coal. The trees never shed them. Instead, the blossoms hung heavy and rotting, until autumn winds stripped them away in dark drifts that covered the ground like ash. Children dared each other to pick the flowers, but no one ever returned with one. Those who claimed they tried swore the branches shifted when touched, as though recoiling from human hands. The house itself was a labyrinth, built not for welcome but for concealment. Hallways twisted longer than the architecture allowed, staircases doubled back upon themselves, doors opened onto walls of brick. Servants who worked there whispered that whole wings of the house had no purpose, rooms filled with dust and silence, chambers locked from the outside, corridors where sound seemed to vanish. A visitor once remarked that the air inside felt weighted, like stepping into a vault meant to keep not treasures but confessions. Even the land conspired in secrecy. The fields that should have grown cotton lay strangely fallow, grass tall and thick, as if the soil refused to be plowed. No one saw wagons of harvest leaving the estate, yet the Nightshades never wanted for wealth. Travelers on the road swore they heard voices carrying from the veranda at night low, measured conversations that stopped the instant anyone drew near. Black Magnolia was not a home. It was a container, a sealed box on southern soil, built not to welcome the living, but to bind something else within its walls. And every board, every nail, every black blossom seemed to insist. This was a house that kept its secrets by swallowing them whole. Travelers along the northern Mississippi roads often spoke of the rarest invitation a stranger could receive: supper at Black Magnolia. It was said that the Nightshades dined in a fashion both lavish and strange, and that their table glittered with silver so old it bore no maker's mark, goblets carved from glass so dark the wine within could not be seen. To be summoned there, usually by a servant who appeared without explanation in town, was considered both an honor and a risk. No one declined outright, but those who accepted never spoke of it after. Some never returned at all. The whispers began with a merchant from Memphis who vanished in 1857. He had boasted in the tavern of receiving a personal note sealed with black wax, an invitation to dine with Alaric Nightshade himself. His horse was found tied to a post the next morning, reins neatly coiled, but the merchant's bed at the inn remained unslept in. A year later, a traveling preacher was last seen walking up the road to the plantation gates, Bible under his arm. His congregation held a service for him 2 Sundays later, though no body was ever recovered. Each disappearance followed the same pattern: a guest of status, a meal at Black Magnolia, and then silence. Those who claimed to have attended and returned told tales that unsettled more than they reassured. They spoke of a table too long for the room, set with more chairs than guests, as though others might arrive from the shadows at any moment. The meal stretched for hours, served course by course in porcelain so thin it seemed to glow. Dishes were plentiful, yet no one could recall their taste afterward, only the way the Nightshades watched them eat. Some swore the children sat in different seats with each course, shifting silently, so that by dessert one could not be certain how many had been there at all. The phrase spread quietly through the county: never count them at dinner twice. Some said it was a warning against tallying the Nightshade children, others against marking how many guests sat at the table. Either way, those who tried claimed their numbers changed with every glance. A man who insisted he dined with 9 rose from the table to find 11. A woman who recalled only 5 swore she saw 7 shadows on the wall. The arithmetic of the meal refused resolution, and it left the survivors unsettled, uncertain if they themselves had been counted. Over time, dinner at Black Magnolia became less invitation and more omen. The absence of those who never returned weighed heavier than the words of those who did. And so the whispers hardened into conviction. Some guests who crossed the threshold of the Nightshade dining room never walked back into the world again. Their names slipped from memory, their records thinned, their seats forever unclaimed except, perhaps, at that endless table, where counting was forbidden and the number of souls present was never the same twice. Alaric Nightshade carried himself like a man carved out of the Old South, tall and elegant, with the measured grace of someone accustomed to command. His voice had the smooth cadence of Southern hospitality, warm enough to disarm, steady enough to persuade. In town, he tipped his hat to ladies, called every man sir, and never allowed a child to pass without a word of kindness. At church socials, when he appeared at all, his presence was magnetic. People leaned closer, as if listening might grant them a piece of his confidence. He seemed, in every public gesture, the model of a landed gentleman, a patriarch who had secured his family's fortune and dignity with tradition and charm. But behind the charm was something colder. Servants whispered of his exacting habits, how he would time the ringing of the supper bell to the second, how no glass was ever filled above a measured line, how he noted every loaf of bread broken, every drop of wine spilled. Even his gait across the veranda was deliberate, as though each step followed a rhythm no one else could hear. He kept his papers locked in a desk that no servant dared to dust, but rumors swirled of the ledger inside, a book where numbers were tallied that made no sense to ordinary men. Those who claimed to have glimpsed its pages usually dismissed as gossipers, yet all telling the same tales spoke of entries never meant for the cotton trade or household accounts. Words like harvest, renewal, exchange were written in a hand so precise it bordered on artistry. Next to them were dates, sometimes a single name, and numbers that did not add up to currency, but to something else. Some swore the dates matched the disappearances of travelers. Others said they marked the blooming of the black magnolias. Whatever they meant, the ledger grew thicker with each passing year, a scripture of a family practice no one dared name. Alaric treated the book with reverence. One servant swore he saw him touch it as if it were a Bible, fingers brushing the cover before every meal. Another claimed that on nights when the shutters rattled and voices carried across the fields, Alaric sat at his desk whispering to it, not reading but confessing. Yet by dawn he would emerge immaculate, waistcoat buttoned, shoes polished, his expression once again that of the perfect host, greeting the morning with a smile that revealed nothing of the night before. For all his polish, it was the ledger that defined him, not his charm. The townsfolk began to suspect that Alaric Nightshade was less a man of land than a keeper of accounts, not bound by soil or coin. His southern grace masked a deeper duty, one recorded not in the registers of county clerks but in the pages of a private scripture where harvest meant more than crops, and exchange did not mean money. Celine Nightshade was spoken of in softer tones than her husband, yet her presence unsettled in ways that Alaric's precision never could. Where he exuded control, she embodied something more elusive, an elegance that felt borrowed from another century, or another world entirely. Pale and composed, she was rarely seen in town except for fleeting errands. When she passed, heads bowed instinctively, as if acknowledging someone cloaked in quiet authority. Her reputation was not built in drawing rooms or at supper tables but in the earth behind Black Magnolia, where she tended a garden unlike any in Mississippi. By day, the garden looked ordinary enough, rows of roses, trellises draped with climbing vines, and a scattering of lilies that never seemed to wilt in the heat. But it was said the true bloom came only after dusk. Locals who strayed too near claimed the air changed once the sun fell, thickening with a fragrance that was neither sweet nor sour but cloying, heavy, the sort of scent that lingered in the throat. Lanterns carried along the road revealed strange silhouettes rising in the darkened beds, flowers opening in slow motion, petals so deep in color they appeared black, their edges faintly glowing as though lit from within. The blossoms were said to hum faintly, a vibration that one felt more than heard, a murmur that traveled through the soil into the soles of the feet. The source of their vigor was the subject of darker whispers. It was common knowledge that the Nightshades buried their dead on the estate, as most families did, but neighbors swore Celine's garden consumed more than its share of remains. They spoke of smoke drifting from the estate at odd hours, of furnaces lit long past midnight, and of wagons arriving heavy but leaving empty. The story most often told, half accusation, half prayer, was that Celine mixed the ash of the departed into her flower beds, feeding her roses with what the earth had already claimed. Some went further, insisting the ash was not only of kin but of guests who never left, travelers whose absence was accounted for in blossoms that bloomed the very next season. Celine moved through the garden with ritual precision. Servants said she whispered verses as she pruned, not from scripture but from something older, syllables that carried like lullabies for the soil. They swore she never cut a flower, never brought a bloom indoors. The roses belonged to the garden alone, as though removing them would undo their purpose. On moonlit nights she was seen kneeling in the beds, her white dress stained with black soil, hands pressed into the ground as if listening for a heartbeat beneath. Those who dared speak of her said Celine's beauty was not of flesh but of something cultivated, grown like her roses in soil enriched by fire and loss. She was less a matron than a keeper of a secret harvest, her garden a living altar where the dead were transformed into blossoms that bloomed only under darkness. And so the whispers endured. The roses of Black Magnolia were red by birth but black by hunger, and every petal carried the memory of ash. The children of the Nightshade family were the deepest root of unease at Black Magnolia. No one could quite decide how many there were, nor how old. Sometimes townsfolk spoke of 3, sometimes 4, and on rare occasions a visitor would insist there had been 5 seated at the supper table. Their names were known in fragments: Lucien, Evangeline, a boy called Thomas, perhaps a girl named Isolde, but like smoke, those names slipped through memory as soon as they were spoken. What lingered was not their words or play, for the Nightshade children were rarely heard laughing, but their faces, pale and watchful, staring from the shadows of the veranda as if time itself had stalled around them. The most unnerving detail lay in their portraits. Alaric, proud of his lineage, had commissioned a series of paintings by traveling artists over the years, insisting they be hung in the Great Hall. The earliest, dated 1849, showed three children dressed in formal attire, stiff and unsmiling, their eyes dark against the light of the canvas. A decade later, another artist was brought, painting the family again in the same room, before the same draped curtain. The children appeared unchanged. Their clothing reflected new fashions, their posture slightly altered, but their faces, the curve of cheek, the shape of mouth, the steady, unblinking eyes were identical. Brushstroke for brushstroke, they had not aged a day. Neighbors whispered that Alaric paid handsomely for such illusions, demanding artists copy the earlier likenesses to preserve an image of eternal youth. But when one painter fled the estate and spoke of his experience in hushed tones at a tavern, his account chilled even skeptics. He swore the children sat for him in silence, unblinking for hours, their skin so cold he thought them statues. He painted what he saw, not what he was told, and when he finished, the result matched perfectly the portrait already hanging every detail, every shadow. It was as though I had painted them before I arrived, he muttered, refusing to return. The effect was not confined to canvas. Families who remembered the children in church pews 20 years earlier swore they looked the same when glimpsed again, dressed in newer fabrics but with no sign of growth or age. Boys who had played marbles in the road swore that one of the Nightshade sons looked no older in 1860 than he had in 1850. A seamstress once remarked that when she measured young Evangeline for a dress, the girl's arms were longer than before, yet her face, her stature, remained unchanged. The uncertainty bred unease. Were they ageless? Were they many children who simply looked the same? Or was memory itself being unstitched whenever one tried to keep account? Whatever the truth, the children of unequal years became another part of the Nightshade legend. They did not grow as other children did. They lingered, fixed in time, as if bound to black magnolia in ways no season could touch, their eyes watching, recording, waiting for a reckoning that no one else could see. Those who claimed to have dined at Black Magnolia never told their stories easily. The details came haltingly, as if speaking them aloud carried some risk. But the fragments, collected over the years in taverns and letters and bedside whispers, all shared a similar rhythm, and together they painted the image of a ritual masquerading as hospitality. The dining room itself was a cavernous hall, ceilings vaulted higher than the architecture required, chandeliers draped with crystal that refracted candlelight into 100 fractured stars. The table stretched nearly the length of the room, carved from oak so dark it seemed to drink the light, polished to a mirror sheen. It was always set the same way, regardless of how many arrived. Silver plates laid with military precision, goblets of black glass arranged in pairs, and candlesticks at every seat. Servants drifted silently along the walls, their faces blurred by shadow, while the Nightshades presided with impeccable charm. Yet there was always one place that remained empty. The head of the table was Alaric's, but beside him, or across, depending on the night, an untouched setting waited. A goblet filled, a plate gleaming, but no guest, no family member, ever sat there. Those who noticed it grew uneasy, for the food at that place was replenished as steadily as all the others, each course laid out and cleared as though someone unseen dined with them. More disturbing still was the shifting count. Survivors swore that at the beginning of the meal they could number their hosts precisely: Alaric, Celine, perhaps 3 children. But as the courses stretched on soup to roast, roast to sweetmeats, they would look up and find the number different. A daughter gone, then returned. A boy seated at the far end who hadn't been there before. At one dinner, a guest counted 9 nightshades when they had begun with 6. At another, the family seemed to dwindle until only Alaric and Celine remained, the rest vanished like smoke. Yet none of the servants reacted. The food continued to be served. The conversation, always measured and polite, carried on uninterrupted. One planter's wife recalled leaving the table to compose herself, convinced her eyes had betrayed her. When she returned minutes later, the table stretched longer, impossibly so, with new candles burning at its far end. She swore she heard the scrape of knives on plates in that distant reach of the room, though no faces could be seen. Another guest reported that during dessert the empty chair filled for just a moment, a pale figure lowering its head toward the plate. When he blinked, it was gone, but the fork lay crooked on the cloth, as if it had been touched. The phrase passed through the county soon after. Never count them at dinner twice. It was not just superstition, but a warning born of witnesses who had tried. Numbers refused to hold at the nightshade table. Something shifted in the act of eating, as though the meal was not a gathering at all, but an invocation, and the empty chair was not empty, it was reserved. Those who worked the land at Black Magnolia never seemed to stay long enough for their stories to root. In the early years, it was enslaved men and women, purchased from nearby auctions or brought in by brokers. Later, when the war's shadow stretched over Mississippi and the laws shifted, the nightshades took on hired hands, field workers, cooks, stable boys. Yet, the pattern never changed. Names appeared briefly in ledgers or on tongues in town, then fell away into silence. Families spoke of cousins who had gone to work for the nightshades and never wrote home again. A freedman's daughter recalled her father leaving with a promise of wages and returning never at all. The county books offered no answers. Wages, once noted for laborers, would vanish between one month and the next, as though the hand of the clerk had never written them. A man listed as driver in March would be gone by April, replaced by another whose own name would fade before the summer's end. Questions asked of Alaric Nightshade met with a smile, always the same refrain. "We keep no servants, only family." It was said with such certainty that those who heard it felt foolish pressing further. Yet they left with the weight of unease, for everyone knew the fields were too large to tend alone, the house too vast to maintain without hands unseen. Neighbors spoke of hearing voices at dusk, songs rising from the quarters where no one was supposed to live. Others swore they saw figures moving between the magnolia trees, pale in the moonlight, their shapes blurred like smoke. A boy once working as a stable hand fled after 2 weeks, claiming that each morning he woke to find a different face beside him in the bunkhouse men he swore were dead, laborers buried months earlier, returning without word or recognition. He never entered the county again. By the 1860s, the whispers hardened. Some claimed the nightshades consumed their workers, not with teeth but with assimilation, folding them into the family so fully that names and records dissolved. Others muttered of rituals, of bodies burned in Celine's garden, their ash feeding her nocturnal roses. A few insisted they had seen the missing at supper, seated among the family, expressionless, silent, eating nothing, their presence acknowledged by no one. Whatever the truth, the servants of Black Magnolia never left a trace beyond rumor. Their absence became part of the estate's architecture, as if the walls themselves devoured memory. And still, Alaric's words rang when questions rose, a phrase that sounded less like denial than confession. "We keep no servants, only family." In that sentence lay the chill of a truth too vast to name. For at Black Magnolia, even bloodlines were counted differently, and not everyone who entered as a servant departed as one. At the edge of the Nightshade estate, half shrouded by the drooping arms of the magnolia trees, stood a chapel that never welcomed a congregation. It was not large, no grand cathedral, but a narrow, crooked building of gray stone that seemed older than the plantation house itself, as though it had been raised before Alaric laid the first beam of Black Magnolia. The townsfolk called it the Hollow Chapel, a name whispered with unease, for no one recalled hearing its bell toll. Not for Sunday worship, not for weddings, not even for funerals. It remained mute, the rusting clapper swaying in storms, yet never striking sound. Some said the silence was intentional, that the bell was meant to hold back a call no one wished to hear. Inside, the strangeness only deepened. Where one expected to find the familiar comfort of saints and scripture, the stained glass windows revealed something else entirely. Vines twisted up in unnatural patterns, looping into circles that never ended. Thorn branches curved into spirals that resembled snares more than symbols of grace. And in the highest window, where the figure of Christ should have stood, there was only the face of a man or perhaps a woman, pale and eyeless, the sockets left blank as if the very glass refused to contain sight. When sunlight poured through, it cast those hollow sockets onto the pews below, so that anyone seated there would find themselves illuminated by empty gazes. The altar was no less peculiar. Instead of a crucifix, a slab of dark wood jutted from the floor, smooth and polished from years of hands pressing against it. The wood bore no mark of carpenter or chisel, yet faint grooves lined its surface, as if something had grown there rather than been built. Locals who dared step inside spoke of a smell that clung to the air, not incense, but damp earth and wilted flowers, the scent of ground newly turned for graves. The hymnals, when opened, contained pages blackened at their edges, words faded into illegibility, replaced by scrawls of circles and crude sketches of faces half submerged in soil. The family attended this chapel privately, always at dusk, lanterns carried in silence across the fields. Servants who once spied on the gatherings claimed there was no preaching, no hymns, only murmurs spoken in rhythm, the sound of wine poured though no cup was raised. When asked why the family did not worship at the county church, Alaric smiled and gave his well-rehearsed reply: "Faith begins at home." But the locals muttered that faith was not what lived in the hollow chapel. Some nights, travelers passing the road swore they saw the stained glass glow from within, not with candlelight, but with something colder, a pallid radiance that made the eyeless faces appear alive. And always, in the silence, the bell loomed above, waiting, heavy, as if it would one day ring not to summon the faithful, but to count the forgotten. When war bled across the South in 1861, the land itself seemed to tremble. Plantations emptied as sons marched to the front, fields withered without labor, and grand houses burned beneath banners of gray and blue alike. Chaos gnawed through Mississippi, yet Black Magnolia endured untouched. While neighbors pawned silver and watched cotton rot in the fields, the Nightshade estate remained whole, its verandas polished, its lanterns lit, as though war had passed around it like a river splitting its stone. No skirmish scarred its land. No regiment camped on its soil. The Nightshades did not defend themselves, and yet nothing reached them. Both Confederate and Union deserters stumbled through those hills, men driven half-mad by hunger and blood, seeking shelter wherever it was offered. Many told of finding their way to the gates of Black Magnolia. Some swore they saw Celine herself on the veranda, beckoning them with a hand pale against the night. Others described Alaric standing proud at the door, offering food, drink, and rest to any soldier who dared cross his threshold, no matter the color of his uniform. In a world shredded by division, the Nightshades alone were impartial. They welcomed all who came. Yet none of those soldiers returned. Reports filtered back in fragments. A deserter from Arkansas claimed he had seen comrades walk up the road to the estate, lanterns swinging, never to rejoin him at camp. A Union scout swore he trailed two fellow soldiers to the magnolia trees, but lost sight of them among the shadows, their voices cut off mid-sentence as if swallowed whole. A Confederate officer, drunk in a tavern weeks later, spoke of a letter left behind by one of his men. The message was short and strange. "The table is set, and they have counted me." The officer burned it the next morning, unwilling to keep such words near him. Locals noticed what the soldiers did not. For every man who vanished, the Nightshade children seemed to multiply. A neighbor swore that in 1862, when she glimpsed the family leaving their chapel at dusk, she counted 8 instead of the usual 4. Another claimed that Celine's garden bloomed blacker than ever that summer, the roses opening wider, the thorns sharp as needles. When pressed, Alaric only smiled and said the war had been generous with its harvest. Other plantations bore scars of fire and famine, their masters broken by the same conflict that consumed the nation. But Black Magnolia thrived in silence, its shutters still nailed tight, its hollow chapel still glowing faintly at night. The Nightshades did not fight in the war, they feasted on it. And those who marched into their gates, seeking refuge, left behind no grave, no name, only a silence that deepened the legend of a family no census could hold. Her name appeared only once in the county records, buried in a footnote of a Union provost's report from 1863. Martha Coyle, widow, age 29, escaped from the Nightshade estate. Most dismissed it as another rumor born of wartime panic, but those who listened to her words carried them like a wound. For Martha spoke of Black Magnolia not in whispers or speculation but as one who had sat at its table, eaten its food, and looked into the hollow eyes of its children. She had lost her husband to Shiloh and wandered south, desperate for work, her infant buried on the road. A servant of the Nightshades found her collapsed at the riverbank and carried her to the estate. There, she said, Celine greeted her with kindness, clothed her, and pressed a cup of dark wine into her hands. They spoke to me as though they had known me, Martha told her interviewers. As though my name had been written in their house long before I arrived. At first, she believed herself rescued. She slept in a chamber high above the veranda, where the shutters were nailed tight and the air smelled faintly of roses turned sour. She rose at dawn to the tolling of a bell she swore she heard, though no one else admitted it had rung. And each evening she was invited to dine with the family. That was where her terror took root. The food, she claimed, was plentiful. Roasted fowl, stewed fruit, bread warm as if from an unseen oven. Yet when she lifted it to her mouth, the taste curdled into something wrong. The food whispered, she said. It pressed words into my teeth. I chewed, and it told me of graves. I swallowed, and it told me whose bones were beneath me. She stopped eating after the third night, but the whispering did not stop. Even water from the goblet rasped in her throat with voices not her own. Worse still were the children. They circled her chair with eerie patience, never smiling, never speaking to her in words, only counting. She swore they counted her bones aloud, tapping each number against the wood of the table. 24 for the ribs, 32 for the teeth, 206 in all, though she could not understand how they knew. One boy leaned close enough for her to feel his breath, murmuring, "You are missing one already." She touched her jaw later that night and found a molar gone, though no blood marked her gums. After 6 weeks, Martha fled in the night, barefoot, clutching nothing but the crucifix from her late husband's neck. She reached Union lines 3 days later, half-starved, muttering prayers that dissolved into weeping. When asked why she had run, her answer was simple, written in a trembling hand that survives in a faded transcript, because at Black Magnolia they do not feed you to keep you alive. They feed you to learn what you are worth. When federal troops finally swept through Mississippi in the late stages of the war, many plantations were left in ruins, their houses burned, and their records scattered to ash. Yet Black Magnolia remained standing, its shutters still sealed, its magnolia trees blooming black against the sky. The soldiers who dared enter brought back few details, but they left with a pair of objects that became legend. 2 ledgers discovered in a locked chest beneath the Nightshade dining hall. One ledger looked ordinary, the sort any plantation master might keep columns of cotton yields, tallies of hogs and cattle, shipments of molasses and rice. The writing was meticulous, dates aligned to the day, profits calculated down to the penny. To any casual eye, it proved the Nightshades were industrious, precise, their estate thriving while others withered. It was the second book that unsettled even hardened men. Bound in cracked leather, its pages smelled faintly of smoke, and its ink was the dark rust of dried blood. Instead of crops or goods, it listed names. Not family names, not kin, but those of guests, servants, and travelers whose fates had been questioned in taverns for years. Whole families appeared on its pages. Merchants from Memphis, preachers from Arkansas, field hands bought and gone. Each entry began with the date of arrival, followed by a single word to describe their offering: bread, blood, bone, breath. And at the end of every line, written with chilling consistency, was the same word: consumed. One soldier, barely 20, swore that the handwriting was too neat for human hands, the letters uniform as if etched rather than penned. Another claimed the pages shifted when no one touched them, numbers and names rearranging as if the book itself were still recording. When the ledgers were taken to Jackson for safekeeping, clerks who cataloged them noticed something worse. Some names matched those already listed in county census records. Yet when they went back to verify, the census books had changed. The names had vanished, as though the Nightshade ledger had erased their place in history to claim them fully for itself. Word of the book spread quickly. The first ledger was shelved with Plantation archives, forgotten as one among many. The second disappeared. Some said it was locked away by Union command, hidden from public view. Others believed it was returned to Black Magnolia, carried back by unseen hands to rest beneath the table where it had been found. Whatever its fate, its existence cemented the whispers into certainty. The Nightshades did not merely host their guests. They accounted for them, measured them, and kept tally not in lives, but in offerings. Cotton may have built other fortunes, but Black Magnolia's true harvest was people, and their worth was written in ledgers that no fire could erase. The story of the banquet of 1864 was never written in a paper or preserved in a church record, yet its details lived on in whispers passed through kitchens, taverns, and graveyards. It was said that Alaric Nightshade, emboldened by the chaos of war, sent invitations across the county, calling on planters, merchants, and surviving families to join him for a feast at Black Magnolia. 30 souls accepted. Some went eagerly, desperate for food in a time of scarcity, others out of curiosity, and a few because they feared what it might mean to refuse. No one ever disputed the number. 30 arrived at the gates beneath the black blooming magnolias on a warm June night. The house glowed with more light than any had ever seen before. Servants carried lanterns across the veranda, and the chapel windows burned white, as though the eyeless figures in glass had been set aflame. Guests entered to the sound of strings, though no musicians were ever accounted for, and the dining hall was laid with silver enough for a king's table. Accounts that trickled out later claimed the table stretched farther than any architecture allowed, each place setting gleaming, every goblet brimming with wine dark as ink. Alaric presided with flawless grace, Celine at his side, the children scattered among the guests like silent ornaments. What occurred during the meal could never be agreed upon, for those who survived spoke in fragments, and their words frayed further with each telling. One woman claimed the courses never ended, that roasted birds were carved open only to reveal smaller birds still living inside. Another insisted the bread bled when torn. A merchant swore the Nightshade children moved seats with every dish, so that he counted 11 of them before dessert, though he remembered only 5 when he first sat down. The empty chair, as always, was laid with plate and goblet, and several guests swore they saw a shadow seated there, faint, translucent, lifting a fork that left no sound when it touched the plate. What is known is that only 4 guests were ever seen outside Black Magnolia again. They staggered away days later, thin and pale, each carrying the same haunted expression. None could account for what had happened to the others. Some refused to speak at all. One muttered only, "We were counted, and we are not finished." Within a year, all 4 were dead, one drowned in a creek though he could swim. Another hanged himself from a magnolia tree, the third wasted to nothing in his bed, and the last disappeared into the hollow chapel, his boots found on the threshold. The other 26 were never recovered, their names eventually vanishing from county records as though they had never been written. But in Celine's garden, neighbors swore. The roses bloomed so dark that summer they appeared blue in moonlight, their petals curling inward like clenched fists. And so the banquet of 64 lived on, a night no one admitted to remembering yet everyone feared, a tally of 30 that dwindled to silence, and a feast that history itself refused to record. By 1865, the war was ending. But the shadow of Black Magnolia had grown larger than any battlefield tale. What had once been rumor hardened into superstition, repeated in the county like a prayer meant to ward off misfortune: never count the nightshades twice. It began with the whispers of those who had glimpsed their suppers, with the testimony of a widow who swore she saw the children multiply like reflections in broken glass, and with the trembling words of deserters who staggered from the estate unable to agree how many had sat beside them. In time, the phrase became a law of its own, one no sane neighbor dared break. The warning stemmed from a strange consistency. Whether at small gatherings or the infamous banquet, no tally of the family ever stayed fixed. A man might swear there were 6 nightshades seated when Alaric led the blessing, only to lift his eyes at dessert and see 10. A woman at market claimed she saw 4 children standing with Celine in the morning, yet that same evening at the chapel she counted 2 more among them, neither taller than her hip. It was not simply confusion or poor memory. Witnesses agreed on the strangeness. The heads around the table would not stay the same number between prayer and dessert. One tale told of a Confederate deserter who took shelter in the estate and joined them for a meal. He confessed later, feverish, that when he tried to count his hosts, he felt his own breath stumble. "It was as if they were counting me back," he muttered before dying of an illness no doctor could name. Another story spoke of a neighbor's child, bold enough to chant the numbers aloud when the family passed in procession from house to chapel. At 7, the child stopped, lips trembling, insisting there was an 8th figure walking just behind the others, though no one else could see it. The boy never spoke again. Even the county minister admitted the strangeness. In his journal, he wrote of being invited once to bless the family table. "I set my eyes upon them," he noted, "and I counted 9. By the time I closed the prayer, there were 11, though none had entered the room. I dare not speak of it aloud." His handwriting grew frantic in the margins, where he scribbled the phrase over and over. "Never count the nightshades twice. Never count them twice." The superstition spread beyond the valley. Travelers warned each other at roadside inns. Children sang it as rhyme, their voices carrying through the fields at dusk. To count them was to invite confusion, to invite their gaze, to risk being added to whatever tally the nightshades themselves kept in their ledgers, for in the silence of Black Magnolia, numbers were not fixed. They were fluid, shifting, hungry, and to measure them was to become part of their measure, a sum that always ended the same way: consumed. In the spring of 1865, as cannons quieted and soldiers limped home in rags, the head of Black Magnolia was suddenly absent. Alaric Nightshade, who for 2 decades had presided over his estate with precision and charm, vanished without trace. No letter marked his departure, no messenger brought news of his death, no grave bore his name. Some in the county whispered that he had finally gone to join the Confederate cause in its dying days, vanishing into battlefields already littered with ruin. Others claimed he had been taken at his own table, swallowed in the same way so many of his guests had been, his chair left occupied by nothing but shadow. Yet at Black Magnolia itself, the story was stranger still. Visitors who dared approach in the months that followed found Celine unchanged, her pale composure now sharpened with a new authority. She hosted with the same eerie grace as before, the shutters still nailed shut, the garden still blooming black, the chapel still humming with unseen voices. But when the time came for supper, she set a place for Alaric as though he had never gone. His chair remained at the head of the table, his goblet filled, his plate laden. Servants carried food to his setting with the same reverence they gave the living, though no hand ever reached for knife or fork. Yet guests swore something was there. One claimed the wineglass at Alaric's place drained slowly through the meal, though no one lifted it. Another swore the silverware shifted when no hand touched it, the faint scrape of a knife against porcelain sounding like a breath too close to the ear. Celine herself gave no explanation, only smiling with the poise of a woman who had lost nothing. "My husband dines with us nightly," she told a visitor. "You may not see him, but he is here." Her certainty chilled more than her words. In the county, speculation ran wild. Some insisted Alaric had struck a bargain, surrendering his flesh while his presence lingered. Others believed the family had absorbed him fully, his name etched not only in their ledgers but in their blood. A rumor spread that if one peered into the chapel glass at night, Alaric's face could be seen among the eyeless figures, a pale outline watching from within the colored vines. But within Black Magnolia itself, his absence was never acknowledged. To Celine he remained the patriarch, invisible yet constant, a host whose presence was felt in the whisper of cutlery and the hush that fell whenever the family raised their heads in unison. For the Nightshades, Alaric had not disappeared, he had only changed form. And in that transformation, the estate grew darker still, for now its master presided over suppers unseen, his silence louder than any blessing he had ever spoken. The summer of 1866 brought heat so oppressive the very air seemed to pulse. Dust clung to the roads, the magnolias hung limp, and the orchard behind Black Magnolia withered into a dark canopy of brittle branches. It was in July, when the nights were restless and the sky refused to cool, that the fire began. A glow rose suddenly from behind the estate, red against the blackened blossoms, and neighbors who lived miles away swore they saw the flames long before they smelled the smoke. They ran toward the blaze, expecting to find the house itself alight, but when they reached the gates they saw only the orchard burning row after row of twisted trees, consumed in a fire that spread too evenly, as if the flames had been waiting there all along. The orchard was said to be older than the house, planted before Alaric's time, its fruit dark-skinned, sweet, and strangely heavy for its size. Celine had rarely allowed anyone near it, and even the servants walked its paths reluctantly. Now it crackled and roared, trunks splitting with sharp reports that echoed like musket fire. But it was not the fire alone that set fear into those who witnessed it. It was the sound that accompanied it. Men and women alike swore they heard voices rise with the flames, dozens of them, screaming and wailing as though the fire devoured not wood but flesh. Some claimed they recognized the cries, voices of kin who had vanished years earlier. One woman fell to her knees, certain she heard her brother's voice shrieking from the heart of the blaze, though he had disappeared on the road in '61. Another neighbor, hardened by war, wept openly, insisting he heard the high, thin wail of children, scores of them layered together, until the orchard roared like a choir of the damned. The longer they listened, the clearer the words became. Not screams at all, but syllables twisted into prayer. Through it all, Celine stood on the veranda, her gown catching the firelight, her hands folded calmly before her. She gave no order to fight the flames, no sign of distress. Some swore she was smiling, her lips moving in rhythm with the cries that came from the orchard. The fire burned until dawn, then guttered out suddenly, leaving not ash but soil black and slick as pitch. When neighbors dared return days later, they found no stumps, no char, only raw earth pressed flat, as though the orchard had never stood. Yet the smell lingered sweet, cloying, like overripe fruit laced with smoke. Travelers who passed the grounds after swore the wind carried faint voices still, rising in chorus from the empty field at dusk. The orchard was gone, but the memory of its burning refused to fade. To those who witnessed it, the fire had not destroyed the trees, it had released them. And whatever had been bound in their roots now drifted free across the valley. carried on smoke that clung to every breath. By the winter of 1866, Black Magnolia no longer resembled a home but a husk that breathed without sound. The orchards were gone, the chapel stood mute, and the garden behind the house grew only withered stems that refused to die back. Neighbors who had once watched the estate with wary curiosity now avoided the road altogether, though their eyes could not help but drift toward the house at dusk. It was then the silence was most profound, a silence that pressed against the skin like cold cloth, for the ordinary signs of life were missing. No smoke curled from the chimneys, though frost covered the fields each morning. No light shone in the windows, though the night stretched longer and darker with each passing week. Yet still, shadows moved along the veranda as though the nightshades lingered. One farmer's wife, walking home at twilight, swore she saw Celine herself standing at the railing, her gown stirring though there was no wind. She looked away for only a moment, and when she lifted her eyes again, there were 4 figures beside her, pale outlines too indistinct to name. Another traveler, a Union veteran, claimed he saw children playing on the steps, their movements strange, like lantern light flickering across water. He called out, but they vanished instantly, leaving only the impression of footsteps pressed into the frost. By December, the estate was said to be entirely abandoned, yet the evidence defied the claim. A passing rider reported hearing laughter, soft and brittle, carrying across the fields at midnight. A neighbor noticed the front door ajar one morning, swinging slowly on its hinges, though by afternoon it had shut itself tight. Even the animals sensed something. Dogs refused to pass the gates, bristling with hackles raised, while horses shied and snorted when led down the road. The strangest accounts came from those who dared glance into the windows. They swore they saw the dining hall laid as if for supper, plates and goblets gleaming in the glow of candles, though no flame could be seen. The table seemed to wait, the empty chair at its head pushed neatly in place, as though Alaric himself had only just risen and would return at any moment. Yet by morning the same window showed nothing but darkness, dust thick on the sills. The plantation had grown silent, yes, but it was not the silence of death. It was the silence of breath held too long, of something watching, waiting, counting. The nightshades no longer showed themselves openly, yet their presence clung to the house as frost clings to glass. They had receded into the shadows, and in that retreat they became larger than ever, a family untethered from the rhythms of hearth and lamp, lingering in a twilight that no season could end. In the spring of 1867, a small party of men from the county seat rode to Black Magnolia, urged on by months of silence from the estate and the unease it spread through the valley. The nightshades had not been seen in a year. No smoke rose from their chimneys, no wagon left their gates, no voice carried across the fields. The orchard was gone, the chapel locked, and the gardens lay skeletal. Yet neighbors swore that shadows still drifted along the veranda, faint as mist. The investigators were not eager, but the pressure of unanswered questions finally drove them past the nailed gates and up the weed-choked drive. The house greeted them with a hush so thick it seemed alive. Dust clung to the walls, but the floors were swept clean, and the faint scent of roses, sweet and spoiled, hung in the air. They moved from room to room, finding no trace of the family, no servants, not even the faintest signs of recent habitation. Beds lay made, garments folded neatly in armoires, shutters still barred from within. It was as though the inhabitants had stepped away only moments earlier, leaving everything in readiness for their return. Yet the silence carried a weight that told the men otherwise. When they entered the dining hall, the breath left them. The long table stretched its impossible length, every place laid in gleaming order. 13 settings, silver polished, goblets brimming, food steaming faintly though no fire burned in the hearth. The bread was soft to the touch, the meat carved but not eaten, the wine warm as though just poured. Each chair was tucked close, yet as the men lingered, they noticed a disquieting shift. One chair would slide back an inch when no one looked directly at it. Another creaked as though a weight had settled upon it. though the seat was visibly empty. None dared sit, but one man, braver or more reckless than the rest, reached for a plate. He swore later that the food whispered when he brought it close, murmuring words he could not repeat before it crumbled to ash in his hand. Another touched a goblet only to find the glass unnaturally cold, so cold it burned his skin. The investigators fled the room without touching another thing, yet the impression followed them. They had not entered an empty house at all, but a supper already begun, one that waited for their presence. When they returned days later with reinforcements, the table was bare. Only the marks remained on the long cloth, faint rings where goblets had stood, crumbs scattered in precise circles, and a smear of dark liquid that would not wash away. The nightshades were gone, yet their table was not abandoned. It was set as an offering, a reminder, perhaps a promise. For those who entered Black Magnolia in 1867 left certain of one thing: the family had not departed. They had only gone unseen, and they had left 13 chairs waiting, as though their count was not yet complete. The Nightshade name is little more than a ghost in the pages of Mississippi's history. Their plantation is gone, collapsed into a tangle of kudzu and bone-white chimneys, and their chapel fell to ruin long before living memory. Yet the unease they left behind endures. Scholars who comb census records from the 1860s notice the gaps first. A family listed one year, erased the next, then suddenly restored, but with a different number. Gravestones bear mismatched dates, children recorded twice in parish ledgers, births without deaths, deaths without burials. The arithmetic of the nightshades has never agreed with itself. What remains is less fact than folklore, yet folklore has its way of bending truth. Never count them at dinner twice, the phrase echoes through old county papers, carved once into the pew of a collapsed church, scribbled on the back page of a school primer found near the ruins of Black Magnolia. It is less warning than law, a superstition given shape by generations who swore the family did not stay still under the eye. Numbers refused to fix them. Witnesses claim to see 7 at a table, blink, and swear there were 8, hear laughter of children, but no children visible, watch shadows of 3 figures moving across a veranda where only 2 stood. In the archives, even careful clerks faltered. A census taker in 1860 recorded 5 nightshades, then, in his notes, confessed, "The woman would not stand still, her image doubled in the window, though her body sat before me. I counted again and failed." Another, in 1866, wrote angrily, "Their names repeat, no matter how I strike the line, they return again, as if written by another hand." A genealogist in the 1920s abandoned her work after tracing the nightshades through 3 counties, only to discover she had been logging the same family under different names. The ink on her files rearranged overnight. And still, the phrase remains whispered, not who they were, but how many they became. The Nightshade family seems to have slipped past the obligation of history to pin them down. A house burns, a ledger rots, a church crumbles, but the count does not stay buried. People in northern Mississippi still tell of dinners where the chairs shift, of census pages that will not add correctly, of portraits where eyes multiply in the background. They say the nightshades are less a family now than a tally unfinished. The mystery lingers not because of absence but because of remainder. Something was left uncounted, something still island. And until the number is known, if it can ever be known, the nightshades remain at the table, plates waiting, shadows lengthening, inviting those who dare to sit and discover whether they will be counted once, twice, or not at all.